I'm Ethan Clarke, 42, and I spent 8 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit. At 34, I was a successful contractor with everything to lose, and I lost it all. My business crumbled, my marriage ended, and my own children questioned my innocence. The state destroyed my life based on fabricated evidence. But when DNA finally cleared my name, they offered me $50 million to stay quiet. What they didn't expect was for me to dig deeper into why they framed me in the first place. The truth I uncovered goes far beyond my case. It's a web of corruption that cost innocent lives and made powerful people very rich. If this story of fighting back against impossible odds resonates with you, please like and subscribe. What I'm about to reveal will change how you see justice forever. Let me take you back to 2015, when my world made sense. I was 34, and Clarke Construction was everything I dreamed of building since I was a kid watching my father lay concrete. My business license hung proudly in my office, a testament to 15 years of honest work that had grown from a one-man operation into a company employing 15 people with annual revenue of $2 million every morning. I'd arrive at our modest headquarters by 6 a.m., coffee in hand, reviewing the day's projects. We specialized in municipal contracts, schools, community centers, infrastructure repairs. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, honest, and it fed 15 families, including my own. My reputation in town was spotless. City officials knew that when Clarke Construction took on a project, it would be completed on time, under budget, and built to last. Home was a 2-story colonial inn. Maplewood Heights, nothing fancy, but Rebecca and I had bought it when the kids were small. Jake was 12 then, all arms and legs and dreams of playing varsity basketball. Lily was 8, still young enough to think her dad could fix anything broken in the world. Rebecca taught 3rd grade at the elementary school, and together we'd built what felt like an unshakable foundation. The morning of March 15th started like any other. I kissed Rebecca goodbye while she graded papers at the kitchen table, ruffled Jake's hair as he wolfed down cereal, and reminded Lily to practice piano. The normalcy of it haunts me now, how ordinary evil can look when it's wearing a badge. I was reviewing blueprints for the new community center renovation when they came. 6 police cars, lights flashing, surrounding my work trucks like I was some kind of dangerous criminal. Detective Raymond led the charge, warrant in hand, his face grim with manufactured righteousness. Ethan Clarke, you're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy to defraud the municipality. The words didn't make sense. I stood there, blueprints still in my hands, watching officers tear through my trucks, my office, my life's work. They found exactly what they were looking for: forged invoices hidden in my filing cabinet, construction materials in my truck that supposedly proved I'd been stealing from job sites, and bank records showing mysterious deposits I'd never made. This is insane, I kept saying, even as the handcuffs clicked around my wrists. I've never stolen anything in my life. Check my books, everything's documented. But they weren't interested in my protests. The evidence was too perfect, too damning. As they led me away, I saw my employees standing in shocked silence. These were men who'd worked beside me for years, who knew my character, but doubt was already creeping into their faces. The ride to the station blurred past in a haze of confusion and growing panic. How do you defend against evidence that doesn't exist until it suddenly does? The evidence against me was a masterpiece of fabrication. Crime scene photos showed my tools at locations I'd never visited, materials stamped with my company's logo found in places that made no sense. The alleged crime was systematic embezzlement. From the Riverside Community Center project, a tall $800,000 renovation that I bid on competitively and won fair and square. According to the prosecution, I'd been inflating invoices, using substandard materials while charging for premium supplies, and skimming funds through a network of fake vendors. The paper trail they constructed was elaborate, doctored receipts dating back months, bank deposits allegedly made to my personal account, even fabricated email chains between me and supposed Kodash conspirators. My court-appointed attorney, Kevin Walsh, was overwhelmed from day one. Fresh out of law school, carrying a caseload of 47 active cases, he had neither the time nor experience to mount an effective defense against such a sophisticated frame-up. During our first meeting in the county jail, he shuffled through papers with the defeated air of a man who'd already decided I was guilty. "The evidence is pretty damning, Ethan," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Bank records show deposits of $47,000 over 6 months. The invoices have your signature." "Those aren't my signatures," I insisted. "And I've never seen those bank accounts in my life. Someone's setting me up." He sighed like he'd heard this story 1,000 times. "Look, if you cooperate, maybe we can work out a plea deal. 5 to 7 years instead of the 12 they're asking for." I'm not pleading guilty to something I didn't do. But Kevin wasn't listening. He was already thinking about his next case, his next client, his next inevitable defeat. The media circus began immediately. Local news painted me as the greedy contractor who'd stolen money meant for the community center that would serve underprivileged kids. The headline in the Riverside Herald read, "Local builder accused of stealing from children's programs." They ran my photo next to images of the unfinished community center, making it look like I'd personally robbed these kids of their future. Rebecca tried to be supportive at first. She attended every court hearing, held my hand during visiting hours, assured the children that Daddy was innocent, and this was all a terrible mistake. But as weeks turned to months and the evidence seemed overwhelming, I watched her faith crumble. "The bank records, Ethan," she said during one painful visit. "How do you explain money in accounts you claim you never opened? Someone opened them in my name. Someone with access to my personal information, my business records. Who would do this to us?" I didn't have an answer then. The frame-up was so complete, so professional, that it seemed impossible for anyone outside law enforcement to have orchestrated it. But that possibility, was too terrifying to voice. The prosecution's case moved forward with frightening efficiency. Witnesses came forward claiming they'd seen me removing materials from job sites. Former subcontractors testified that I'd pressured them to inflate bills. Even my own bank manager testified about suspicious activity in accounts I'd supposedly opened. Each piece of evidence was a nail in my coffin, and I was helpless to stop it. The trial was a foregone conclusion. Judge Harrison presided with the cold efficiency of a man who'd already made up his mind. From the moment jury selection began, I could see the predetermined outcome in his eyes. He overruled every objection. Kevin managed to stammer out, allowed prosecutors to present evidence that should have been inadmissible, and rushed proceedings whenever my defense tried to present alternative theories. The prosecution's star witness was Tommy Hernandez, a former city planning official who claimed I'd approached him about kickback schemes. Tommy took the stand with rehearsed confidence, spinning elaborate tales about meetings that never happened, conversations we'd never had. Years later, I'd learned that Tommy was facing his own embezzlement charges at the time, charges that mysteriously disappeared after his testimony. Mr. Clarke approached me in the parking lot after the city council meeting. Tommy testified, his voice steady and convincing. He said he had a proposition that could make us both rich. He wanted me to approve change orders that would inflate his contracts. I watched the jury's faces as he spoke. 12 good people who'd probably never been inside a courtroom before, trying to decide between the word of a man in an orange jumpsuit and a city official in a pressed suit. The outcome was inevitable. Kevin's cross-examination was pathetic. He asked softball questions that Tommy deflected easily, failed to challenge obvious inconsistencies, and seemed more interested in getting the ordeal over with than defending his client. When I suggested questions during breaks, he'd nod absently and then ignore every suggestion. "Why don't you ask him about his own financial troubles?" I whispered urgently during one recess. "We can't go on fishing expeditions, Ethan. Stick to what we can prove." But we weren't proving anything. We were just watching my life get dismantled piece by piece. The guilty verdict came after just 6 hours of deliberation. When the jury foreman read those 2 words, "guilty on all counts," the world tilted sideways. Rebecca gasped behind me. I heard Jake start crying. Lily asked why everyone was sad. Judge Harrison sentenced me to 12 years for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. 12 years for crimes I'd never committed, based on evidence I'd never created, in a system that had decided my guilt before I'd even been arrested. As the bailiff led me away in shackles, I turned back to see my family. Rebecca was crying, her face a mask of confusion and growing acceptance that maybe, just maybe, she'd been married to a criminal all along. Jake wouldn't look at me. Lily waved, still too young to understand that Daddy wouldn't be coming home. That night in county lockup, waiting for transfer to state prison, I lay on a thin mattress staring at the ceiling. The guilty verdict document sat in my file somewhere, official proof that Ethan Clarke was a criminal. But lying there in the dark, I made a promise to myself. I would find out who did this to me and why, even if it took the rest of my life. 3 weeks later, Rebecca filed for divorce. The papers cited irreconcilable differences, but we both knew the truth. She couldn't live with the possibility that she'd been wrong about me, and I couldn't blame her for choosing our children's stability over faith in a man the system had branded a felon. The divorce was finalized while I was in transport to Millbrook Correctional Facility. Rebecca got the house, full custody, and permission to deny me visitation rights. Just like that, everything I'd built, my business, my family, my reputation, was gone. Millbrook Correctional Facility was a concrete monument to human failure, mine, and society's. The maximum security prison housed 2,800 inmates in conditions that would have violated every construction code I'd ever learned to follow. The smell hit you first. Industrial disinfectant, mixed with desperation and the accumulated misery of thousands of men who'd lost their freedom. My cellmate was Jerome, a lifer who'd been inside for 11 years on an armed robbery conviction. He was the first person to offer me practical advice about survival. "First thing you gotta understand, college boy," he said, looking at my soft contractor's hands, "is that your old life is dead. Whatever you were out there don't matter in here. What matters is who you align with, who you cross, and how quick you learn the rules." The rules were simple and brutal. Keep your mouth shut unless spoken to. Don't trust anyone completely. Find a group for protection, but don't get too close. Never show weakness. Never admit guilt, but don't proclaim innocence too loudly either. Half the guys in here claimed they were framed. The first letter from Jake arrived 3 weeks into my sentence. I'd been hoping for contact, praying that my kids would write, would give me something to hold on to. But opening that envelope, seeing my 12-year-old son's careful handwriting, broke something inside me that I'm not sure ever fully healed. "Dad," it read, "Mom says you did bad things, and that's why you can't come home. I don't understand why you would steal money from kids. My friends at school say their parents won't let them play with me anymore because of what you did. I'm angry at you. I don't want to write to you anymore. Jake." I read that letter 50 times before I finally put it away. My son, my boy who used to run to the door when I came home from work, now believed I was a criminal. The system hadn't just taken my freedom. It had poisoned my children against me. Prison routine became my salvation and my torture. Wake at 5:30 a.m. Count. Breakfast. Work detail in the laundry facility. Lunch. Yard time if weather permitted. Dinner. Count. Lockdown. The days blended together in an endless cycle of gray uniformity. I learned to navigate the complex social hierarchy. The white supremacists wanted to recruit me, seeing a middle-class white-collar criminal as a valuable addition. The black inmates regarded me with suspicious indifference. The Latinos ran most of the contraband trade and stayed neutral unless you crossed them. Jerome taught me the art of prison friendship, close enough for protection, distant enough to survive betrayal. Every man in here got somebody on the outside they'd sell you for, he warned. Don't give nobody enough to hurt. You with. My first appeal was filed by Kevin, who managed to screw up the paperwork and missed 2 critical deadlines. The appeal was dismissed on procedural grounds without anyone ever examining the evidence against me. Kevin sent a form letter expressing regret and suggesting I contact other counsel, but with what money? Rebecca had divorced me, my business. Assets were frozen as proceeds of crime, and my house was gone. The appeals court rejection hit harder than the original conviction. I'd maintained hope that someone, somewhere in the system, would look at my case and see the obvious problems. Instead, I got a rubber-stamp dismissal and the crushing realization that I was truly alone. 6 months into my sentence, I got word that Rebecca had started dating someone, a teacher from her school named Chris, who the kids apparently liked. The news came from my mother during one of her painful monthly visits, delivered with the awkward compassion of someone trying to cushion an inevitable blow. "She's moving on, Ethan," Mom said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The children need stability." I understood, but understanding didn't make it hurt less. Somewhere in suburbia, another man was tucking my children into bed, helping with homework, being the father figure I couldn't be. The family I'd built was rebuilding itself around the hole I'd left behind. Salvation came in the form of a plastic library card. After 18 months of numbness and routine, I wandered into Millbrook's law library, a cramped room with outdated legal texts and a few ancient computers. The librarian, Mrs. Foster, was a retired teacher who volunteered 2 days a week. She looked at me with the first genuine kindness I'd experienced since my arrest. "You look like a man with questions," she said, gesturing to the shelves of legal volumes. "What are you trying to learn?" "Everything," I said. "I need to understand how this happened to me." She handed me a basic legal research guide and a yellow legal pad. "Start with the fundamentals. Learn the language first. Then you can start asking the right questions." I became obsessed. During my 4 hours of daily recreation time, instead of watching television or playing cards, I buried myself in case law and legal procedures. I learned about evidence suppression, prosecutorial misconduct, ineffective assistance of counsel. I studied successful appeals, focusing on cases where innocent people had overturned wrongful convictions. The law library became my sanctuary. Other inmates thought I was crazy. Jailhouse lawyer was usually said with derision, but I didn't care. For the first time since my arrest, I felt like I was fighting back instead of just enduring. Harold Freeman became my unlikely mentor, a 58-year-old lifer serving time for murder. Harold had spent 15 years studying law and had successfully helped 3 inmates overturn their convictions. He was quiet, methodical, and brilliant in a way that his 3rd-grade education should have made impossible. "Most guys come in here thinking the law is complicated," Harold told me during one of our late-night discussions. "Truth is, it's simple. Problem is, it's simple in ways that usually favor the system. But if you're patient, if you're thorough, sometimes you find the cracks." Harold taught me to think like a lawyer, how to read cases for precedent, how to research procedural requirements, how to construct legal arguments. More importantly, he taught me to be systematic and patient. "Your case," he said after I'd shown him my trial transcripts, "feels wrong. Too clean. Real crimes are messy, evidence contradicts. Witnesses get confused. Timelines don't line up. Perfect. Your case reads like somebody wrote a story and then went looking for evidence to support it. That observation changed everything. Instead of trying to prove my innocence, I started looking for proof of my frame-up. 1. Requested copies of all evidence. Studied the timeline of discovery. Analyzed the backgrounds of key witnesses. Slowly, patterns emerged. My first small victory came when I successfully challenged another inmate's conviction on a procedural error. Dennis had been convicted of assault, but his lawyer had failed to object to inadmissible evidence. Using what? Harold taught me. I filed a motion that got Dennis's sentence reduced by 2 years. Word spread quickly through the prison. Suddenly, other inmates were approaching me with their cases, their appeals, their desperate hope that maybe this college boy could find the magic words that would set them free. I couldn't help them all, but I helped where I could, and each small victory taught me more about how the system worked and how it could be beaten. The law library card became my most precious possession. More valuable than cigarettes or commissary money, it represented possibility. Every day I spent in that cramped room, surrounded by thick volumes of legal precedent, was a day I was fighting for my freedom instead of just serving time. Mrs. Foster noticed my dedication. You know, she said one afternoon, I've been volunteering here for 8 years. I've seen a lot of men try to lyre their way out. Most give up after a few months. You're different. I have to be, I said. This is my life. She nodded thoughtfully. Have you considered that maybe your case could help other people too? I hadn't, but the seed was planted. Maybe fighting for my own justice could become something larger. 4 years into my sentence, hope arrived in an envelope marked Innocence Project of America. The letter was from Sarah Martinez, a staff attorney who specialized in cases involving prosecutorial misconduct. Harold had helped me craft a detailed petition outlining the inconsistencies in my case, and somehow it had captured their attention. Mr. Clarke, the letter read, your case presents several concerning elements that warrant further investigation. We would like to review your complete file and discuss the possibility of representation. I read that letter so many times the paper wore soft at the creases. After 4 years of fighting alone, someone with real legal credentials was finally willing to listen. Sarah visited 3 weeks later. She was younger than I expected, maybe 35, with the focused intensity of someone who'd seen too many innocent people destroyed by a broken system. She spread my case files across the visiting room table like a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. The evidence against you is remarkably comprehensive, she said, studying crime scene photos. Almost too comprehensive. Real embezzlement cases usually involve months or years of sloppy financial management. This looks like someone built a complete criminal enterprise in your name and then gift-wrapped it for prosecutors. That's what I've been saying for 4 years. I believe you. But belief isn't proof, and we need proof. She pointed to evidence photos showing construction materials allegedly stolen from job sites. These materials, the serial numbers, the purchase orders, the chain of custody documentation, it's all perfect. In my experience, perfect evidence is often fabricated evidence. Sarah's investigation began slowly and methodically. She requested access to the original physical evidence, most of which had been destroyed after my conviction, according to standard procedures. But the documentation remained, and that's where the first cracks appeared. Look at this timeline, she said during her second visit, spreading out a chart she'd constructed. March 3rd, police get anonymous tip about suspicious activity at your business. March 7th, first search warrant issued. March 12th, second warrant for financial records. March 15th, arrest warrant and raid. What's wrong with that? The financial records they discovered during the March 12th search were dated March 10th and 11th, but according to the bank, Those transactions were entered into the system on March 6th, one day before the search warrant was even issued. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Someone had planted evidence in my business before they even had legal authority to search it. The frame-up had been planned and executed with inside knowledge of the investigation timeline. Sarah's next discovery was even more damning. 3 of the key witnesses against me, including Tommy Hernandez, had all received favorable treatment in their own criminal cases within 6 months of my trial. Tommy's embezzlement charges were dropped. Construction worker Luis Rivera had a DUI reduced to reckless driving. City Inspector Frank Coleman had tax evasion charges mysteriously disappear. "This isn't coincidence," Sarah explained. "This is a pattern of witness tampering and prosecutorial misconduct. Someone was orchestrating your conviction and paying for cooperation with leniency." But the biggest breakthrough came when Sarah requested the complete case file from the prosecutor's office. By law, they were required to preserve all evidence, including exculpatory evidence that might have proven my innocence. What she found was stunning. 17 documents that should have been disclosed to my defense attorney, but never were. Among them was a handwriting analysis report that concluded the signatures on the fraudulent invoices were inconsistent with known exemplars of the defendant's handwriting. There was also a bank security video showing someone other than me opening one of the allegedly fraudulent accounts. Most damning of all was an internal police memo questioning the reliability of the anonymous tip that started the investigation. "This is prosecutorial misconduct of the worst kind," Sarah said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "They had evidence that proved your innocence, and they buried it." The Innocence Project agreed to take my case officially. For the first time in 4 years, I had real lawyers fighting for me, investigators uncovering the truth, and the resources to challenge the system that had destroyed my life. But I was also learning something darker about my case. The level of coordination required to frame me so completely suggested this wasn't personal, it was professional. Someone with significant power and resources had wanted me silenced, and they'd used the entire criminal justice system to do it. The question that haunted me as I lay in my cell each night was simple. Why me? What had I done, or what had I known, that made me a target? The DNA test results arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, 6 years into my sentence. Sarah had fought for months to get the physical evidence tested, using advanced techniques that hadn't been available during my original trial. The lab report was technical and dense, but the conclusion was crystal clear. The construction materials, allegedly stolen from job sites and found in my possession, contained DNA from 3 different individuals, none of whom were me. "This proves the materials were planted," Sarah explained during her visit that week, her voice carrying the excitement of a liar who just found the smoking gun. "Someone handled these items and placed them in your truck. We have genetic proof that you never touched the most crucial evidence against you." But the DNA results revealed something even more significant. One of the genetic profiles matched a name in the CODIS database: Raymond Torres, a career criminal with a history of breaking and entering who had been arrested 2 weeks after my conviction for an unrelated burglary. Torres had no connection to construction or municipal contracts. He was a petty thief who someone had paid to plant evidence. Sarah tracked Torres down through the court system. He was serving a 3-year sentence in a minimum security facility 2 hours north of Millbrook. When confronted with the DNA evidence, Torres broke down and confessed everything. "I needed the money," he told Sarah during a recorded interview. "This guy approached me in a bar, said he'd pay me $5 grand to put some stuff in a truck and make an anonymous call to police. Easy money for an hour's work." "Who approached you?" "Never got his real name. Called himself Mike. White guy, maybe 50, expensive suit. Drove a black Mercedes. He knew things about me, my arrest record, my debts, where I lived. scared the hell out of me. What did he tell you to do exactly? Put these construction tools and materials in the back of a white Ford pickup with Clarke Construction painted on the side. Truck was parked outside some office complex. Then call the police tip line and report suspicious activity. Torres's confession was devastating to the prosecution's case, but it raised new questions. Who was Mike? How did he know about my truck, my business, my schedule? The level of surveillance and planning suggested this wasn't random. Someone had been watching me, studying me, preparing to destroy me. The DNA evidence also revealed that key documents in my case had been handled by unknown individuals before being discovered by police. Fingerprint analysis of the fraudulent invoices showed prints from at least 2 people other than the police officers who processed them as evidence. Media attention began shifting in my favor. The local paper that had crucified me during my trial now ran a front-page story titled, "New Evidence Suggests Wrongful Conviction." Rebecca called for the first time in 3 years, her voice hesitant and confused. "I saw the news report," she said, "about the DNA test." "Ethan, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," I told her, though my heart was pounding. "I understand why you did what you did. The kids have been asking questions. Jake is in college now. He's studying criminal justice, if you can believe that. Says he wants to understand what happened to his father. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to hope that maybe my children would learn the truth. Maybe they would understand that their father wasn't the criminal the system had painted him to be. But even as the evidence mounted in my favor, I sensed resistance from the prosecutor's office. District Attorney Robert Harrison, Judge Harrison's brother, though that connection hadn't been disclosed during my trial, refused to comment on the new evidence. The police department issued a statement defending their investigation and questioning the reliability of DNA testing. "They're going to fight this," Sarah warned me. "Admitting you were wrongfully convicted means admitting systematic failures in their investigation, prosecution, and judicial oversight. That's a lot of careers and reputations at stake." She was right. The same system that had railroaded me into prison wasn't going to admit its mistakes easily. But for the first time in 6 years, I had scientific proof of my innocence and real lawyers fighting for my freedom. The DNA results also attracted attention from investigative journalists and other innocence advocacy groups. My case was becoming a symbol of everything wrong with the criminal justice system, and that attention was both powerful and dangerous. Someone had framed me 6 years ago, and now that their perfect crime was unraveling, I had to wonder, how far would they go to keep their secrets buried? The DNA evidence led Sarah's investigation team to Raymond Torres, but Torres led them to something much bigger. Following the money trail from his payoff revealed a web of financial transfers that ultimately connected to a shell company called Riverside Development, LLC. The company's registered address was a P.O. box, but corporate filings showed it was owned by someone I recognized, City Planning Commissioner David Sterling. Sterling had been one of the officials who'd approved my bid for the community center project. He'd sat across from me in city council meetings, shaken my hand, praised my company's work ethic and competitive pricing. He'd also been the one who'd suggested I bid on several other municipal projects in the months before my arrest. Sarah's financial investigation revealed the scope of Sterling's corruption. Over 5 years, Riverside Development, LLC had received over $12 million in city contracts for projects that were either never completed or grossly overpriced. Sterling had been using his position to steer contracts to his own company, while eliminating honest competitors who might expose the scheme. The bank records were damning. Payments to Torres for planting evidence. Bribes to witnesses like Tommy Hernandez and Luis Rivera. Even payments to court officials and police officers who'd helped manufacture the case against me. My conviction hadn't been about me personally. I'd being collateral damage in a massive corruption operation. You were targeted because you were too honest, Sarah explained during one of our strategy sessions. Your bids were legitimate and competitive. If Sterling's company was going to win future contracts, they needed to eliminate contractors who might undercut their inflated prices or expose their substandard work. But Sterling wasn't working alone. The investigation revealed a network that included Police Chief Thomas Kane, Assistant District Attorney Janet Walsh, and Judge Harrison himself. They'd created a system where honest contractors were framed and eliminated, allowing Sterling's company to dominate municipal construction with inflated contracts and shoddy work. The community center project, the one I'd allegedly embezzled from, had been completed by Sterling's company for 40% over budget, using materials that failed inspection within 2 years. The building was already showing structural problems that would require massive repairs. My honest bid would have built it right the first time for half the cost. Even more disturbing was the discovery that I wasn't their first victim. Sarah's team identified 3 other contractors who'd been prosecuted for similar crimes over the past 8 years. All had been honest, competitive bidders who'd posed threats to Sterling's operation. All had been convicted on remarkably similar evidence patterns: planted materials, fabricated financial records, and coached witness testimony. One of those men, James Chun, had died in prison 3 years into his sentence. His family had maintained his innocence, but without resources for appeal, he died branded as a criminal. Another, Frank Romano, was still serving time in a different facility. The third, Walter Hayes, had served his full sentence and been released, but his life had been destroyed. His construction business was gone, his family had disowned him, and he was working as a day laborer to survive. This is organized crime using the criminal justice system as a weapon, Sarah told reporters during a press conference announcing our findings. These men weren't just wrongfully convicted. They were systematically eliminated by a corruption network that spans law enforcement, the judiciary, and municipal government. The evidence against Sterling and his co-conspirators was overwhelming. Federal investigators were now involved, following money trails that led to offshore accounts and shell companies. The FBI had opened a RICO investigation, treating the entire operation as an organized criminal enterprise. But the most heartbreaking discovery was the human cost. The community center that I'd supposedly embezzled from served low-income families in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods. Sterling's shoddy construction had created safety hazards that put children at risk. The money he'd stolen was meant to provide after-school programs, job training, and safe recreational facilities for kids who had few other options. My frame-up hadn't just destroyed my life, it had enabled the continued exploitation of some of the most vulnerable people in our community. While I'd rotted in prison, Sterling had gotten rich building substandard facilities with stolen money, putting families and children in danger. The weight of that realization was almost harder to bear than my own suffering. I'd spent 7 years focusing on my personal injustice, but the real crime was so much larger. My imprisonment had been a tool to enable ongoing corruption that harmed thousands of people. As the federal investigation expanded, more victims came forward. Families whose children had been injured in Sterling's poorly constructed buildings. Small contractors who'd been driven out of business by rigged bidding processes. City employees who'd been threatened or fired for questioning suspicious contracts. Justice wasn't just about clearing my name anymore. It was about stopping a criminal enterprise that had corrupted an entire city's government and endangered its most vulnerable citizens. The morning of my release, October 15th, 2023, I stood at the gates of Millbrook Correctional Facility holding a plastic bag containing everything I owned. Legal documents, a few letters, and the clothes I'd worn during my arrest 8 years earlier. They didn't fit anymore. Prison food and limited exercise had changed my body, just as incarceration had changed everything else about me. Sarah was waiting in her car, along with a representative from a reintegration program that helped exonerated prisoners adjust to freedom. The official exoneration had come through 2 weeks earlier when the governor, facing mounting pressure from federal investigators and media attention, had pardoned me and ordered a full investigation into prosecutorial misconduct in my case. Walking through those gates felt surreal. For 8 years, I dreamed of this moment, but the reality was overwhelming. The sounds hit me first: traffic noise that seemed impossibly loud, birds singing without the constant background hum of prison ventilation, the simple sound of wind through trees. My senses, dulled by years of institutional sameness, were suddenly flooded with input I'd forgotten existed. The drive to Sarah's office should have been triumphant, but instead it was disorienting. The world had moved forward without me. Buildings I didn't recognize lined streets that seemed familiar yet foreign. The skyline had changed. Even the cars looked different, sleeker, more computerized, filled with technology that hadn't existed when I was arrested. "Take your time," Sarah said, noticing my overwhelmed silence. "Everyone experiences this differently. Some men feel euphoric. Others feel lost. There's no right way to process 8 years of stolen life." At her office, she handed me something I hadn't touched in nearly a decade: a smartphone. "It's yours," she said. "Basic model, but it has internet access and GPS. The world runs on these things now." I stared at the device like it was alien technology. In 2015, I'd had a flip phone that made calls and sent text messages. This computer in my hand could access all human knowledge, connect me to anyone in the world, and track my every movement. The learning curve ahead felt impossibly steep. The temporary housing they'd arranged was a studio, apartment in a transitional facility for people re-entering society. The room was small but clean, with a bed, kitchenette, and private bathroom luxuries. That felt almost decadent after 8 years of shared cells and communal facilities. But lying alone in that quiet room the first night, I understood why many ex-prisoners struggled with freedom. The silence was deafening. Prison had structure, routine, predictability. Every moment was regulated, every decision made for you. Freedom meant choice, and after 8 years, the simple decision of what to eat for breakfast felt overwhelming. I stood in the small kitchen for 20 minutes, paralyzed by the dozens of breakfast options available at the corner store. The most painful adjustment was social. I'd missed 8 years of conversations, cultural references, technological evolution, political changes. People casually mentioned events, movies, songs, and social media trends that meant nothing to me. I felt like a time traveler trying to navigate a world that had evolved beyond my understanding. My first attempt to reconnect with Jake and Lily was arranged through Rebecca. They agreed to meet me at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown, that hadn't existed when I was arrested. Jake was 20 now, a junior in college studying criminal justice. Lily was 16, a high school sophomore who'd grown from the 8-year-old girl who used to sit on my lap into a young woman I barely recognized. The reunion was awkward and heartbreaking. Jake had his mother's eyes but my stubborn chin, and he studied me with the analytical intensity of someone who'd spent years trying to understand his father's supposed crimes. Lily was polite but distant, speaking to me like I was a stranger she'd been obligated to meet. "I read about the case," Jake said carefully, "about the corruption and the frame-up. I'm sorry we didn't believe you." "You were 12, I said. "You believed what everyone told you to believe." "I don't blame you for that, but the damage was deep." 8 years of believing their father was a criminal had shaped their adolescence. They defended me to friends, then stopped defending me, then learned to avoid the topic entirely. Now they had to reconstruct their understanding of their childhood and their family history. "Are you going to try to come back into our lives?" Lily asked, her voice carrying a mixture of hope and apprehension. "I'd like to," I said, "but only if you want me to." I know I can't just pick up where we left off 8 years ago. We're all different people now. The world I'd returned to was unrecognizable in ways both large and small. Technology had evolved beyond my comprehension. Social media dominated daily life. Political divisions seemed deeper and angrier. Even simple tasks like shopping or banking required digital literacy I didn't possess. But underneath all the changes, I sensed something else, an opportunity. My case had become a symbol of systemic corruption and wrongful conviction. Media outlets wanted to interview me. Advocacy groups sought my support. Other wrongfully convicted men reached out for advice and encouragement. 8 years in prison had stolen my life, but maybe they'd also prepared me for something larger than the life I'd lost. The settlement offer arrived exactly 1 week after my release, delivered by courier to Sarah's office in a thick manila envelope marked "Confidential Attorney Eyes Only." $50 million. The number was so large it seemed abstract, like monopoly money rather than real compensation for 8 stolen years of my life. Sarah spread the settlement papers across her conference table, her expression grim as she read through the terms. "This is unusual," she said. "Most wrongful conviction settlements take months or years to negotiate. The state's offering $50 million with minimal negotiation, but look at these conditions." The terms were draconian. Complete silence about all aspects of my case, including the corruption investigation. No media interviews, no book deals, no speaking engagements, no cooperation with other victims or their attorneys. The settlement would seal all court records permanently. Most troubling, it included a clause requiring me to refuse to testify in any criminal proceedings related to my case. "They're not just buying your silence," Sarah explained. "They're trying to shut down the entire corruption investigation. Without your testimony, it becomes much harder to prosecute Sterling and his co-conspirators." The pressure to accept was immediate and intense. Rebecca called within hours of the offer being made public, her voice carrying 8 years of accumulated stress and financial hardship. $50 million, Ethan, she said. "That's enough to secure the kids' college, education, pay off the house, give us all financial security for life. After everything we've been through, don't we deserve that?" My mother was more direct. "Take the money and move on," she advised during our first phone conversation since my release. "You can't get those 8 years back, but you can make sure the rest of your life is comfortable. Fighting this system nearly destroyed you once already." Even my new therapist, Dr. Lisa Chun, suggested that accepting might be the healthiest choice. "You've spent 8 years fighting for justice," she said during our second session. "Maybe it's time to focus on healing and rebuilding your life." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. $50 million was an enormous amount, far more than typical wrongful conviction settlements. The speed of the offer and the extreme confidentiality requirements suggested desperation rather than generosity. Sarah's investigation into the settlement offer revealed why the state was so eager to pay. Federal prosecutors were building a RICO case against Sterling's corruption network, and my testimony was crucial to proving the conspiracy charges. Without me, they might only be able to prosecute individual crimes rather than the systematic racketeering that had destroyed multiple lives. The corruption investigation has uncovered at least $40 million in stolen public funds, Sarah explained. But the civil liability could be hundreds of millions when you factor in wrongful imprisonment suits from you and the other victims, construction defects that will require expensive repairs, and federal sanctions for the systematic civil rights violations. The $50 million was cheap compared to the total potential liability if the full scope of the corruption was exposed in court. More troubling was what Sarah discovered about the timing. The settlement offer had been drafted 2 weeks before my official exoneration, before the governor's pardon, before the corruption charges were filed. before the media attention reached its peak. Someone had been planning this buyout since the DNA evidence first surfaced. This suggests coordination between the state attorney general's office and the defendants, Sarah warned. They're working together to minimize damage rather than seeking justice. I thought about James Chun, who died in prison for crimes he didn't commit. About Frank Romano, still serving time for Sterling's embezzlement. About Walter Hayes, working day labor jobs because his reputation was destroyed. About the families living in dangerous buildings constructed with stolen money while Sterling lived in a mansion bought with their tax dollars. The settlement papers included a deadline. I had 72 hours to accept or the offer would be withdrawn permanently. The pressure was designed to prevent careful consideration, to force an emotional decision based on fear and financial desperation. Sarah laid out my options starkly. Accept the settlement and you're financially secure but legally silenced forever. Reject it and you face years more litigation, possible retaliation, and no guarantee of any compensation. The state could also limit future settlement offers if you refuse this one. But there was another consideration: the other victims. If I accepted silence money, Sterling's network might escape serious consequences. Frank Romano would remain in prison. The corruption that had enabled my frame-up would continue operating under new leadership. More innocent people would be victimized. On the final day before the deadline, I sat in my temporary apartment staring at the settlement papers. $50 million represented security, comfort, and the ability to rebuild my life without financial stress. It meant I could support my children's education, help other wrongfully convicted people, maybe even start a new business. But it also meant abandoning the fight for justice, not just my own, but justice for everyone who'd been victimized by this system. The decision came down to a simple question: was my personal comfort worth more than the truth? I rejected the settlement at 11:47 p.m. on the final day, 3 hours before the deadline. Sarah filed the rejection letter electronically, and within minutes, my phone started ringing. The first call was from the state attorney general's office, then my mother, then Rebecca, all expressing varying degrees of shock, disappointment, and concern for my mental health. "You just turned down $50 million, Rebecca said, her voice hollow with disbelief. $50 million, Ethan. Do you understand what that means for our children's future? I understand what it means for other people's children if I stay silent," I replied. The next morning, I used a portion of the legal defense fund that had been established by supporters to hire private investigator Marcus Thompson, a former FBI agent who specialized in corruption cases. If the state was so desperate to silence me, I needed to understand exactly what they were hiding. Thompson's first report arrived 2 weeks later, and it was devastating. The corruption network was far larger than even Sarah had suspected. Over 15 years, Sterling's operation had systematically eliminated honest contractors, rigged municipal bidding processes, and constructed substandard buildings throughout the region. The pattern wasn't limited to my city. It spanned 3 counties and involved dozens of municipal officials. "This isn't just local corruption," Thompson explained during our first meeting. "This is organized crime that's been operating like a shadow government. They control construction contracts, zoning decisions, safety inspections, and law enforcement responses. Anyone who threatens their operation gets neutralized." The investigation revealed that I'd been targeted specifically because my company had bid on a major school renovation project worth $12 million. Sterling's company had planned to win that contract with an inflated bid of $18 million. But my competitive $8 million proposal would have exposed their price-fixing scheme. "Your honest bid would have saved taxpayers $10 million, Thompson said. But it also would have raised questions about why other projects were so expensive. They couldn't risk that level of scrutiny. Even more disturbing was the discovery that the corruption network had files on dozens of local contractors, complete with personal information, financial records, and potential vulnerabilities. My file included details about my family, my business, practices, even my daily routines information that would have been valuable for planning the frame-up. Thompson's investigation also revealed the human cost of the corruption. The community center where I'd allegedly embezzled funds had serious structural problems within 2 years of construction. The roof leaked, the foundation was cracking, and the electrical system was so dangerous that the building had been closed temporarily 3 times for safety violations. Sterling's company used substandard materials and cut corners on everything. Thompson reported, "The building is basically a disaster waiting to happen, but it serves a low-income neighborhood, so nobody with political power cares enough to demand accountability." The pattern was repeated throughout the region. Schools, with roofs that leaked within months of construction, bridges that developed cracks in their first year, public housing projects where residents complained of mold, faulty wiring, and heating systems that failed regularly. Sterling's company had built it all using the cheapest possible materials while charging premium prices. But the most shocking discovery was that the corruption network had a systematic approach to eliminating threats. My case wasn't unique, it was part of a pattern. Thompson identified 8 other contractors who'd been prosecuted for fraud or embezzlement over the past 15 years. All had been honest bidders whose proposals would have undercut Sterling's inflated contracts. "They've been using the criminal justice system as a weapon," Thompson explained. "Identify honest competitors, manufacture evidence against them, use corrupted law enforcement and prosecutors to secure convictions, then move forward with overpriced contracts while the honest competition is in prison." 3 of those contractors had died in prison. 2 others had served their sentences and been released into poverty and disgrace. 1 was still serving time, and 2 had committed suicide after their convictions. The corruption network hadn't just stolen money, it had destroyed lives and families, systematically. Thompson's investigation also revealed the financial scope of the operation. Over 15 years, the corruption network had stolen an estimated $200 million in public funds through inflated contracts, kickbacks, and fraudulent billing. That money had been used to buy politicians, judges, and police officials, creating a self-perpetuating system of corruption. "The $50 million they offered you was a bargain," Thompson said. "If this investigation exposes the full scope of their operation, the financial liability could exceed $500 million in stolen funds, wrongful imprisonment settlements, and reconstruction costs for buildings that need to be rebuilt safely." The investigation files made for horrifying reading. Children attending schools in buildings with dangerous structural defects. Low-income families living in public housing with toxic mold and faulty electrical systems. Emergency responders operating from firehouses with compromised structural integrity. The corruption hadn't just enriched criminals, it had put innocent people in danger. But Thompson's most important discovery was that the operation was still active. Even as Sterling and some of his co-conspirators faced federal charges, new players had moved into positions of power. The system that had enabled the corruption remained intact, and new schemes were already in development. Rejecting that settlement was the right choice, Thompson concluded. But you need to understand the risks. These people have killed to protect their operation before. They'll kill again if they think you're an existential threat. The weight of that warning settled over me like a shroud. Fighting for justice was one thing. Risking my life was another. But looking at the files of dead contractors and endangered children, I realized I'd already made my choice when I rejected the settlement. Some fights are worth the risk. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Sterling's own records. During the FBI raid on his offices, investigators discovered a hidden safe containing what could only be described as a corruption playbook. Detailed plans for a massive development scheme that would have displaced thousands of low-income families while generating hundreds of millions in profits for the conspiracy. The documents, which Thompson shared with me under protective order, revealed the true scope of their operation. It wasn't just about rigging construction contracts. It was about systematically gentrifying entire neighborhoods by forcing out honest contractors, buying up distressed properties, and redeveloping them with city subsidies obtained through corrupted officials. The plan was called Project Renaissance, and it was breathtaking in its audacity and cruelty. Over 10 years, they intended to systematically condemn buildings in 3 low-income neighborhoods, claiming they were unsafe due to construction defects. The residents, mostly minorities and working-class families, would be relocated to temporary housing that would become permanent displacement. The condemned properties would then be sold to Sterling's development company for below-market prices and redeveloped into luxury condominiums and commercial spaces. "Look at this timeline," Thompson said, spreading the development plans across his conference table. "Your frame-up was just the beginning. They needed to eliminate honest contractors who might expose the substandard construction that would justify future condemnations." The documents showed that my community center project was deliberately constructed with inferior materials and shoddy workmanship. The building's eventual failure wasn't a consequence of corruption. It was the goal. When the center became unsafe, the city would condemn the entire block, displacing 300 families and clearing the way for luxury development. But the plan went deeper than real estate fraud. The conspiracy had been systematically weakening the foundations of municipal government, corrupting not just individual officials, but entire systems of oversight and accountability. Building inspectors were paid to overlook safety violations. Zoning board members received kickbacks to approve inappropriate developments. Even the city council had been compromised through campaign contributions and outright bribes. They weren't just stealing money, Thompson explained. They were stealing democracy itself. They've created a shadow government where real decisions are made by criminals for profit, while elected officials serve as puppets. The human cost of Project Renaissance was staggering. The neighborhoods targeted for renewal were home to 8,000 people, including 2,400 children. Many of these families had lived in their communities for generations, building networks of support, cultural identity, and economic stability that would be destroyed by forced displacement. The conspiracy's files contained detailed profiles of community leaders, activists, and residents who might oppose the development plans. These people were marked for neutralization through various means. Some would be arrested on fabricated charges. Others would face financial pressure through tax audits or code enforcement. And the most problematic would be completely destroyed. Through the same systematic frame-up process that had sent me to prison. Among the marked targets was Maria Santos, a community organizer who'd been fighting against unsafe housing conditions. Her file contained plans to plant drugs in her apartment during a welfare check and have her arrested for possession with intent to distribute. Another target was Reverend James Williams, a pastor who'd been organizing residents against displacement. The conspiracy planned to frame him for embezzling church funds. "They've turned corruption into a science," Thompson said. "Every aspect is planned, documented, and executed with precision. They know exactly how to destroy someone's life while making it look legitimate." But the most chilling discovery was the casualty list, a spreadsheet documenting the eliminated threats to their operation. My name was there, marked as neutralized, imprisoned. So were the names of 3 other contractors who died in prison, 2 community activists who'd committed suicide after being arrested on fabricated charges, and a city council member who died in a suspicious car accident after demanding audits of municipal contracts. The conspiracy had been killing people for 15 years. And they'd made it look like accidents, suicides, and natural causes. The car accident that killed Councilman Peters wasn't an accident. It was murder disguised as brake failure. The suicide of contractor Walsh wasn't depression. It was the result of systematic, psychological torture that had driven him to despair. This is organized crime at its most sophisticated, Thompson concluded. They've created a system where murder looks like misfortune and corruption looks like legitimate business. The development plans also revealed the financial structure of the operation. Sterling's network had established dozens of shell companies, offshore accounts, and legitimate businesses that served as fronts for money laundering. The profits from their corruption were being invested in legal enterprises, creating a business empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But perhaps most disturbing was the political protection the conspiracy enjoyed. The development plans referenced specific politicians at the state and federal level who were aligned with their interests. Campaign contributions, real estate deals, and direct payments had created a network of protection that extended far beyond local government. Your case isn't just about wrongful conviction, Thompson warned. It's about exposing a criminal enterprise that has tentacles reaching into every level of government. The people protecting this operation have the power to make you disappear permanently. Reading through those files, I understood why they'd offered me $50 million to stay silent. My testimony wasn't just evidence of my own frame-up. It was the key to unraveling 15 years of systematic corruption, murder, and theft that had stolen hundreds of millions of dollars and destroyed countless lives. The corruption network had built an empire on the graves of honest people, and they'd do anything to protect it. But looking at the names of their victims, contractors like me who just wanted to do honest work, community leaders who'd fought for their neighborhoods, families who'd lost their homes to manufactured crises, I knew I couldn't let their deaths be meaningless. Project Renaissance was still in its early stages. If exposed now, it could be stopped. Thousands of families could keep their homes, honest contractors could compete fairly, and the criminals who'd murdered and stolen for 15 years could finally face justice. But stopping them would require destroying their entire network of protection, and that meant risking everything I'd already sacrificed to regain. The second settlement offer arrived on a Friday morning, delivered by a different courier to a different address, my temporary apartment rather than Sarah's office. This time, the amount was $75 million, and the tone was distinctly threatening. Final offer, read the cover letter from the State Attorney General's office. Mr. Clarke's continued refusal to accept reasonable compensation demonstrates a pattern of vexatious litigation that may result in sanctions and potential criminal charges for obstruction of justice. The threat was barely veiled. Accept the money and disappear, or face retaliation from the same system that had already destroyed 8 years of my life. Sarah was furious when I showed her the offer. They can't threaten criminal charges for refusing a civil settlement, she said. This is witness intimidation, pure and simple. But we both knew that legal technicalities hadn't stopped them from framing me the first time. If they wanted to fabricate new charges against me, they had the infrastructure and corrupt officials necessary to make it happen. The pressure campaign intensified immediately. Rebecca called within hours, her voice strained with 8 years of accumulated stress and financial hardship. $75 million, Ethan, she said. Do you understand what you're doing to our family? Jake's college loans, Lily's future, my retirement, all of it could be secure. Instead, you're chasing some impossible dream of justice that might get you killed. My mother was more direct. You're being selfish, she said during a tense phone conversation. You've already proven your innocence. Take the money and let someone else fight these battles. Even Jake, who'd been supportive of my quest for justice, expressed doubts during our weekly coffee meeting. Dad, I've been researching corruption cases for my criminal justice classes. he said carefully. The people who try to take down systems this big usually end up destroyed themselves. Is it worth risking your life when you could take this money and help people in other ways? The reasonable arguments were compelling. $75 million could fund scholarships for underprivileged kids, support wrongful conviction organizations, maybe even start a foundation to help other victims of corruption. I could do good with that money while staying safely silent about the conspiracy. But Thompson's investigation had revealed something that made accepting impossible. The retaliation was already beginning. Frank Romano, the contractor still serving time for Sterling's embezzlement, had been transferred to a maximum security facility after his lawyer filed a motion for DNA testing. Walter Hayes, the released contractor working day labor jobs, had been arrested on suspicious drug charges the day after my settlement rejection made the news. They're sending a message, Thompson explained. Cooperate with your investigation and bad things happen. Accept the settlement and the persecution stops. More troubling was what the investigation had revealed about the intimidation campaign against me. Thompson's security sweep of my apartment had found listening devices in 3 rooms. My phone was being monitored, my email was being intercepted, and surveillance teams were documenting my daily activities. They know where you go, who you talk to, what you eat for breakfast, Thompson warned. This level of surveillance is designed to demonstrate their capability and make you feel helpless. The psychological pressure was working. I found myself checking locks multiple times, varying my daily routines, and avoiding public places where I might be vulnerable. The paranoia was exhausting, and I understood how previous victims had been driven to despair. But the decision crystallized when I received a handwritten letter from Maria Santos, the community organizer targeted for frame-up in the Project Renaissance. Documents. Someone had leaked information about the conspiracy's plans to community leaders, and Maria had reached out to thank me for refusing the settlement. Mr. Clarke, her letter read, I know we've never met, but your courage is giving hope to families who thought nobody cared about our neighborhoods. The people trying to destroy our community counted on your silence. Every day you keep fighting is another day. Our children have homes to sleep in. The letter included photographs of the families living in the communities targeted for displacement. Children playing in neighborhoods they might lose. Elderly residents who'd lived in the same houses for 50 years. Small businesses that had served these communities for generations. All of it would be destroyed so that Sterling's network could build luxury condominiums for wealthy buyers. I thought about James Chun, who died in prison believing his family would be ashamed of him forever. About the contractors who committed suicide rather than live with false convictions. About Councilman Peters, murdered because he demanded transparency in municipal contracting. The corruption network was counting on my self-interest, my desire for security and comfort after 8 years of hell. They were betting that $75 million would be more appealing than risking my life for abstract principles, like justice and truth. They were wrong. I called Sarah that evening and dictated my formal rejection of the settlement. But this time, I included a statement that would be released to the media. I cannot accept payment for silence while the criminals who destroyed my life continue to endanger innocent families. My freedom is meaningless if I use it to protect the people who stole 8 years from me and killed honest men who posed threats to their empire. The rejection letter went out at midnight. By 6 a.m., the story was national news. By noon, I was receiving death threats on social media and voicemails promising that I'd regret choosing the hard way. But I also received hundreds of messages of support from people who understood that some fights are worth the risk. Other wrongfully convicted men offered their solidarity. Families in the targeted neighborhoods sent prayers and gratitude. Even some current municipal employees reached out anonymously to offer evidence of ongoing corruption. Rebecca called one final time, her voice resigned rather than angry. I don't understand your choice, but I respect it, she said. Just promise me you'll be careful. The kids have already lost 8 years with their father. They can't lose you permanently. I promise, I said, though we both knew it was a promise I might not be able to keep. That night, I sat in my apartment looking at the rejection letter I'd signed. $75 million versus justice for the dead and protection for the innocent. Security versus truth. Comfort versus courage. For the first time since my release, I felt truly free. Not because I was out of prison, but because I'd chosen principle over profit, justice over personal gain. The war was just beginning, but I was finally fighting on the right side. The media war began within hours of my settlement rejection. Cable news networks picked up the story of the wrongfully convicted contractor who turned down $75 million to continue fighting corruption. But the coverage was carefully manipulated by the conspiracy's media allies. Conservative outlets painted me as an attention-seeking opportunist who was exploiting the wrongful conviction for fame and profit. Liberal networks focused on the systemic racism in the criminal justice system while downplaying the specific corruption in my case. Both narratives served the conspiracy's interests by diverting attention from the evidence of organized crime. The breakthrough came when FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, no relation to my incompetent original attorney, called Sarah's office requesting a meeting. The federal investigation into Sterling's network had expanded beyond local corruption into a full RICO case, and they needed my testimony to establish the conspiracy's interstate activities. Your case was the key that unlocked everything, Agent Walsh explained during our first meeting at the FBI field office. But it's also given us evidence of a criminal enterprise that spans 3 states and involves dozens of conspirators. The federal investigation had been building quietly for months, triggered initially by banking irregularities identified in Sterling's financial records. But my case had provided the human evidence they needed to prove systematic racketeering, rather than isolated corruption. Organized crime isn't just a mafia anymore, Walsh explained. Modern criminal enterprises use legitimate businesses, municipal contracts, and corrupted officials to steal from taxpayers while maintaining the appearance of legality. Sterling's network is a textbook example of 21st century organized crime. The FBI's evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showing hundreds of millions in stolen public funds. Recorded conversations between conspirators discussing frame-ups and intimidation tactics. Documentary evidence of bribes, kickbacks, and money laundering operations spanning 15 years. But the most damning evidence came from Sterling's own records. The conspiracy had been so confident in their protection that they documented everything. Assassination plans, witness intimidation strategies, even detailed cost-benefit analyses of frame-ups versus assassinations. They considered murder a business expense, Walsh said, showing me spreadsheets that calculated the costs of eliminating threats. Your frame-up cost them $200,000 in bribes and planted evidence. Killing you would have cost $50,000. But they chose the frame-up because it eliminated the threat while providing cover for future corruption. The federal investigation had also identified the conspiracy's political protection network. 3 state legislators, a federal congressman, and 2 judges had received payments or benefits in exchange for protecting the operation. Campaign contributions had been systematically used to buy influence and immunity from prosecution. But exposing the conspiracy meant facing their retaliation. The day after my FBI testimony became public knowledge, my apartment was burglarized. Nothing valuable was stolen, but personal documents were scattered and family photographs were destroyed. A cartons was destroyed. Clear message that they could reach me anywhere. Thompson hired additional security after the break-in. But the psychological warfare continued. Anonymous phone calls at all hours. online harassment campaigns questioning my sanity and motives, vandalism of my car, and threatening messages left where I'd be sure to find them. The conspiracy also escalated their legal warfare. The state filed a lawsuit claiming that my refusal to accept the settlement constituted fraud and demanding repayment of the legal fees spent on my exoneration. Municipal officials filed complaints with the bar associations seeking to have Sarah's law license suspended for frivolous litigation. They're trying to exhaust our resources and isolate us from supporters, Sarah explained during one of our strategy sessions. It's a classic organized crime tactic, used the legal system as a weapon while conducting psychological warfare. But the federal investigation was providing protection and legitimacy to our fight. When the conspiracy's media allies tried to discredit my testimony, FBI evidence supported my claims. When local officials tried to intimidate witnesses, federal agents offered protection. When corrupt judges tried to block evidence, federal prosecutors filed motions in higher courts. The turning point came during a public hearing before the House Oversight Committee, broadcast live on C-SPAN. The hearing featured testimony from multiple victims of the conspiracy, including me, Frank Romano, now released pending appeal, and Walter Hayes, charges dropped after evidence of frame-up emerged. Congressman David Peterson, who chaired the committee, asked the question that crystallized everything. Mr. Clarke, you were offered $75 million to remain silent about this corruption. Why did you refuse that money? Because silence is complicity, I answered, looking directly into the cameras. I spent 8 years in prison for crimes I didn't commit while these criminals got rich stealing from taxpayers and endangering families. Taking their money would have made me an accessory to ongoing crimes against innocent people. The hearing footage went viral, generating millions of views and shifting public opinion decisively in favor of the investigation. Congressional phone lines were flooded with calls demanding action. Editorial boards that had initially been skeptical began calling for federal intervention. But the conspiracy's desperation was becoming dangerous. Thompson's security team intercepted communications, suggesting that more direct action was being planned against key witnesses. The same network that had murdered Councilman Peters and driven contractors to suicide was now discussing permanent solutions to the federal investigation. They're backed into a corner, Agent Walsh warned during a security briefing. Desperate. Criminals do desperate things. We're implementing witness protection protocols, effective immediately. The final phase of the public battle began when Sterling himself decided to cooperate with federal investigators. Facing multiple life sentences under RICO charges, he agreed to provide testimony against his co-conspirators in exchange for a reduced sentence. His lawyer contacted the FBI with an offer that stunned everyone involved. Sterling wants to tell everything, Walsh informed me during an emergency meeting. Names, dates, financial records, assassination plans, he's willing to expose the entire network to save himself from life in prison. Sterling's cooperation broke the conspiracy's code of silence. Within days, other members began reaching out to federal prosecutors, offering their own deals. Police Chief Kane provided evidence of evidence tampering and witness intimidation. Assistant District Attorney Janet Walsh revealed how prosecutions were coordinated to eliminate threats. Even Judge Harrison admitted to taking bribes in exchange for predetermined verdicts. The domino effect was swift and devastating to the conspiracy. Bank records were seized, revealing the full scope of the money laundering operation. Search warrants were executed simultaneously across 3 states, recovering millions in stolen assets. Key figures who had seemed untouchable just weeks earlier were arrested on federal charges. But perhaps most importantly, the investigation revealed evidence that cleared Frank Romano completely and provided grounds for appeals for 3 other wrongfully convicted contractors. The systematic frame-up operation that had destroyed so many lives was finally being exposed and dismantled. The media narrative shifted dramatically as federal evidence replaced speculation. Conservative outlets that had attacked me were forced to acknowledge the scope of the corruption. Liberal networks focused on the systemic abuse of power rather than just individual injustice. Even international media began covering the case as an example of American institutional corruption. The public hearings concluded with a bipartisan call for federal legislation strengthening oversight of municipal contracts and creating new protections for whistleblowers. The Clarke Act, named after my case, would require independent oversight of large municipal projects and establish federal penalties for using the criminal justice system to eliminate business competition. Standing outside the federal courthouse, after giving my final testimony, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 8 years. Vindication. Not just personal vindication, but justice for all the victims who hadn't lived to see their names cleared. The conspiracy that had stolen my freedom, destroyed my family, and murdered honest people was finally being held accountable. The network that had operated with impunity for 15 years was collapsing under the weight of federal prosecution and public scrutiny. But the victory came with a sobering realization. This level of corruption wasn't unique to my city or my state. Similar networks were probably operating across the country, using the same tactics to enrich criminals while endangering innocent families. The fight for justice wasn't ending, it was just beginning. The federal courthouse was packed on the morning of September 15th, 2024. For the sentencing of David Sterling and his co-conspirators. I sat in the front row, flanked by other victims and their families, watching as the men who had destroyed so many lives finally faced justice. Sterling entered the courtroom in orange prison garb, his confident demeanor replaced by the hollow stare of a man who'd lost everything. The planning commissioner who had once commanded respect and wielded enormous power now shuffled in shackles, facing the consequences of 15 years of systematic corruption. Judge Patricia Morrison read the charges with clinical precision. Racketeering, conspiracy, money laundering, bribery, evidence tampering, and civil rights violations. Each count represented not just legal technicalities, but real human suffering, lives destroyed, families displaced, honest people murdered or driven to suicide. Mr. Sterling, Judge Morrison said, her voice carrying the weight of institutional authority, your criminal enterprise represents one of the most comprehensive corruption schemes in federal prosecution history. You didn't just steal money. You weaponized the criminal justice system against innocent people. Sterling received 4 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. The gallery erupted in applause, quickly silenced by court officers, but the emotional release was palpable. Families who had spent years believing their loved ones were criminals finally heard official acknowledgement of the truth. Police. Chief Kane received 35 years for racketeering and civil rights violations. His empire of evidence tampering and witness intimidation had enabled the conspiracy's worst crimes, including the systematic frame-ups that had sent innocent men to prison. Assistant District Attorney Janet Walsh was sentenced to 25 years for prosecutorial misconduct and conspiracy, a deliberate suppression of exculpatory evidence and coordination with corrupt officials had perverted the course of justice in dozens of cases. Judge Harrison received 20 years and was permanently barred from practicing law. His acceptance of bribes and predetermined verdicts had corrupted the very foundation of judicial integrity. But the most emotional moment came when Judge Morrison addressed the victims directly. To Mr. Clarke, Mr. Romano, Mr. Hayes, and families of those who didn't live to see this day, the system failed you catastrophically. These sentences cannot restore the years stolen from you or bring back the lives lost to this conspiracy. But they represent our commitment that such systematic abuse of power will not be tolerated. The financial restitution was staggering. The Conspiracy was ordered to pay $340 million in damages to victims, municipalities, and affected communities. Sterling's assets, including his mansion, luxury cars, and offshore accounts, were seized and liquidated. The money would fund reconstruction of the substandard buildings and compensation for wrongfully convicted individuals. Frank Romano walked out of prison that afternoon, his conviction officially vacated after 23 months of wrongful imprisonment. Walter Hayes received a formal apology from the governor and expungement of his criminal record. The families of James Chun and the other contractors who had died in prison received official recognition of their innocence and financial settlements. But justice extended beyond individual vindication. The federal investigation had uncovered evidence of similar corruption networks in 6 other states, triggering a nationwide examination of municipal contracting practices. The Clarke Act was signed into law by the president, establishing federal oversight of large public projects and creating new protections for honest contractors. The conviction headlines dominated national news for weeks, sparking conversations about institutional corruption and the need for systematic reform. Editorial boards called it a watershed moment in the fight against organized crime in government. Legal scholars described it as a landmark case, demonstrating how the RICO Act could be used against non-traditional criminal enterprises. For me, the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source: a letter from the current students at Roosevelt Elementary School, one of the schools that had been built with Sterling's substandard construction. The children had written thank you notes after learning that my case had led to safety improvements in their building. "Dear Mr. Clarke," one letter read, "thank you for making our school safe. My mom says you could have taken money and stayed quiet, but you chose to help kids you didn't even know. You're a hero." Reading those letters, I understood that justice wasn't just about punishment for the guilty. It was about protection for the innocent. The children writing those letters would attend school in buildings constructed safely because corrupt contractors could no longer operate with impunity. The conspiracy's defeat also had immediate practical consequences. Municipal bidding processes were reformed with new transparency requirements. Independent oversight boards were established to review large contracts. Whistleblower protections were strengthened to encourage honest employees to report corruption. Most importantly, 3 other wrongfully convicted contractors in different states had their cases reopened based on evidence patterns identified in our investigation. The systematic approach that had destroyed my life was finally being recognized and addressed comprehensively. Standing outside the courthouse after the sentencing, surrounded by other victims and their families, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Justice had been served, but it had taken 8 years of my life and the deaths of innocent men to achieve it. The victory was real, but the cost had been enormous. Agent Walsh approached as the crowd was dispersing. "You know this is just the beginning," she said. "The investigation you triggered has identified corruption networks in 23 cities. We're going to need your help exposing them." I looked back at the courthouse where Sterling and his co-conspirators had finally been held accountable. 8 years ago, I'd been a simple contractor who just wanted to do honest work. Now, I was apparently becoming a professional corruption fighter. "When do we start?" I asked. 6 months after the convictions, I stood in front of a half-completed affordable housing project, my new business license in hand and a crew of 12 honest workers behind me. Clarke Construction 2.0 wasn't just about rebuilding my career. It was about rebuilding communities that had been damaged by corruption and neglect. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was constructing homes in the same neighborhood that Sterling's Project Renaissance had targeted for displacement, where his conspiracy had planned luxury condominiums for wealthy buyers. We were building affordable housing for the families who'd lived there for generations. Mr. Clarke called Maria Santos, the community organizer whose family had been saved from frame up by our investigation. The foundation looks good. These homes will last. That's the point, I said, checking the concrete work that my crew had poured that morning. Sterling's buildings were designed to fail so he could justify condemnations and redevelopment. These homes are built to shelter families for generations. The healing process had been slower and more complex than I'd anticipated. Therapy with Dr. Chun helped me process 8 years of trauma, but rebuilding relationships with my children required patience and humility that challenged me daily. Jake was 21 now, finishing his criminal justice degree with plans to attend law school. He'd chosen to specialize in wrongful conviction cases, inspired partly by my experience, but mainly by his own sense of justice. Our relationship was different than it had been when he was 12, more like peers than father and son, but it was genuine and growing stronger. "I've been thinking about your case for my senior thesis," he told me during one of our weekly coffee meetings. "Not the corruption part. Everyone knows about that now. I want to write about the psychological impact on families when the justice system destroys someone innocent." Lily was 17, a high school senior with her mother's intelligence and my stubborn streak. She'd struggled more with my absence during her formative years, but she was slowly allowing me back into her life. Her way of processing my story was through art. She'd painted a series depicting the journey from imprisonment to vindication. That had been displayed in the school's annual exhibition. "It's called Broken System, Unbroken Spirit," she explained when I attended the exhibition opening. The first painting shows the arrest, all dark colors and sharp angles. The last one shows the courtroom during Sterling's conviction, bright colors flowing into hope. Looking at her artwork, I saw 8 years of confusion, anger, and eventual understanding translated into visual narrative. She'd captured emotions that I'd never been able to express in words. Rebecca and I had found an unexpected friendship in the aftermath of vindication. The anger and betrayal that had defined our divorce had been replaced by mutual understanding of how the system had manipulated both of us. She'd remarried Chris, the teacher, and they'd built a stable home for our children during the years I couldn't be there. "I owe you an apology," she said during a dinner we'd shared to discuss Jake's graduation plans. "I should have believed you, should have fought harder for the truth. You protected our children when I couldn't," I replied. "That was the right choice given what you knew at the time." The financial settlement from the conspiracy's restitution had provided security I'd never imagined. But money couldn't restore the years we'd lost or repair the damage to our family bonds. What it could do was provide the foundation for rebuilding, not just my life, but the lives of other victims. The work itself was therapeutic. Every nail driven correctly, every measurement checked twice, every safety standard exceeded was a small victory against the corruption that had nearly destroyed me. My crew understood they were building more than houses. They were constructing proof that honest work could thrive when corruption was eliminated. The community had embraced Clarke Construction 2.0 with enthusiasm that sometimes overwhelmed me. Residents brought lunch to the work sites. Children drew pictures of the construction progress, and elderly neighbors shared stories of the displacement they'd avoided because of our investigation. "You saved our neighborhood," Mrs. Rodriguez told me one afternoon, watching us frame her new neighbor's house. "But more than that, you showed us that sometimes the system works when good people fight hard enough." The psychological healing was ongoing and imperfect. I still checked locks twice, still varied my daily routines, still felt hypervigilant in crowds. 8 years of imprisonment and months of death threats had left psychological scars that wouldn't heal quickly. But therapy was helping me understand that trauma didn't have to define me. Dr. Chun helped me separate the legitimate caution, born of real danger, from the paranoid anxiety that could paralyze me if I let it. "You've survived something that would have destroyed most people," she reminded me during one session. "The fact that you're functioning, working, rebuilding relationships, That's remarkable resilience, not weakness. The advocacy work was becoming as important as the construction business. I testified before legislative committees, spoke at law enforcement conferences, and consulted with other wrongful conviction cases. The expertise I gained through suffering was helping other victims navigate systems that seemed designed to defeat them. But perhaps the most meaningful healing came through simple moments that I'd taken for granted before my arrest. Saturday, morning coffee with Jake discussing his future plans. Lily asking for help with a school project. Rebecca including me in family decisions about the children's lives. These ordinary interactions were extraordinary gifts, evidence that families could heal even after systematic attempts to destroy them. Love was more resilient than I'd understood, capable of surviving years of separation and rebuilding, stronger than before. Standing at the construction site as the sun set over the neighborhood Sterling had tried to destroy, I felt something approaching. Peace. The houses rising around me represented more than affordable housing. They were proof that justice could restore more than just reputations and bank accounts. Sometimes justice could rebuild entire communities. 2 years after Sterling's conviction, I stood in the headquarters of the Clarke Foundation for Justice Reform, watching our legal team review cases of wrongfully convicted individuals across the country. The foundation, funded by my restitution, settlement and donations from supporters, had become a national resource for fighting institutional corruption and supporting exonerated prisoners. The Foundation's charter, framed on the wall behind my desk, stated our mission simply: to ensure that no innocent person suffers what Ethan Clarke endured, and that systematic corruption finds no safe harbor in American institutions. In 24 months, we'd helped overturn 7 wrongful convictions, identified corruption networks in 12 cities, and provided reintegration support to 34 exonerated individuals. But the numbers only told part of the story behind each statistic. Was a human being whose life had been restored and a family reunited with truth. Our most recent victory involved Patricia Williams, a single mother who'd been framed for embezzling from the nonprofit where she worked. The same playbook Sterling's network had used against me: planted evidence, coached witnesses, suppressed exculpatory evidence, had been replicated by a different corruption network in Ohio. Patricia had served 3 years of a 10-year sentence before our investigation exposed the frame-up. The foundation saved my daughter's childhood, Patricia told me during the press conference announcing her exoneration. She would have grown up believing her mother was a criminal if you hadn't fought for the truth. Those moments made every sacrifice worthwhile. The years stolen from me, the family relationships damaged, the trauma that still woke me up some nights, all of it gained meaning when translated into justice for others. The Foundation's work had also influenced policy at the federal level. The Clarke Act had been strengthened with additional provisions requiring independent testing of evidence in cases involving municipal corruption. 3 states had established specialized units to investigate public corruption, using protocols developed from lessons learned in my case. But perhaps the most unexpected development was Jake's decision to join the foundation after law school. Graduation. My son, who'd spent years questioning whether his father was a criminal, had become one of the country's youngest experts on wrongful conviction cases. "I want to finish what you started," he told me when he accepted our offer to head the Foundation's legal department. There are hundreds of people still in prison because of corruption networks like Sterling's. We can't save them all, but we can save some of them. Working alongside Jake had restored something I thought was permanently lost: the chance to be a mentor to my son, to pass on not just genetic inheritance but values and purpose. He'd inherited my stubborn streak, a channeled it into legal precision that was already making him formidable in court. Lily had taken a different path, studying journalism at Northwestern with plans to specialize in investigative reporting on institutional corruption. Her high school art project had evolved into a documentary film about families affected by wrongful convictions, which had been accepted to several film festivals. I want to tell the stories that don't make it to court, she explained during her college orientation visit. The wives who lose their husbands to false convictions, the children who grow up believing their parents are criminals, the communities destroyed by systematic corruption. Someone needs to document the human cost. My relationship with Rebecca had evolved into something neither romantic nor bitter, a partnership focused on our children's well-being and shared commitment to preventing other families from enduring what we'd experienced. She'd become the Foundation's victim advocacy coordinator, using her teaching skills to help exonerated individuals navigate reintegration challenges. "We can't get back the years we lost," she said during one of our Foundation board meetings, "but we can make sure our suffering helps other families stay together." The personal healing continued to unfold in unexpected ways. My friendship with Harold, my prison mentor who taught me legal research, had been maintained through letters and visits. He was serving a life sentence for a crime he insisted he didn't commit, and the Foundation was reviewing his case for possible innocence claims. "You did what I always told you to do," Harold wrote in his latest letter. "You found the cracks in the system and used them to get justice. Now you're making those cracks bigger so other people can escape through them." The construction business had thrived beyond my expectations, partly because of my notoriety, but mainly because communities had learned to value contractors who prioritize safety and honesty over profit margins. Clarke Construction 2.0 employed 47 people and had projects scheduled 18 months in advance. But more importantly, we'd helped establish new industry standards for municipal contracting. The Sterling protocols required independent oversight, whistleblower protection, and transparency measures that made corruption significantly more difficult to conceal. Every building we constructed carried a small plaque, "Built with integrity, protected by truth," a reminder that honest work was both possible and powerful when corruption was eliminated. The psychological scars remained, but it transformed from debilitating trauma into motivational fuel. The hypervigilance that had once paralyzed me now helped me identify corruption patterns that others missed. The paranoia that had isolated me became healthy skepticism that protected other potential victims. Trauma can destroy you or transform you, Dr. Chun observed during one of our sessions. You've chosen transformation, and that's helped you transform the lives of others. Standing in the Foundation offices, surrounded by case files of people we'd helped and others we were still fighting for, I reflected on the journey from that March morning in 2015, when police had arrested me for crimes I didn't commit. 8 years in prison had stolen irreplaceable time with my children, destroyed my marriage, and cost me opportunities I'd never recover. But those same 8 years had also revealed reserves of strength I hadn't known I possessed, taught me skills I'd never have developed otherwise, and connected me to a community of survivors who'd become my extended family. The corruption network that had tried to destroy me had ultimately created something they never intended, a systematic approach to fighting institutional corruption that was now being replicated across the country. My case had become a blueprint for exposing organized crime in government and protecting honest people from systematic persecution. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been institutionalized. The tools we'd developed, the legal precedents we'd established, and the advocacy networks we built would continue fighting corruption long after my personal story was forgotten. That evening, I sat with Jake and Lily at the family dinner Rebecca still hosted monthly, watching my children plan their futures around principles of justice and truth. 8 years of separation had been followed by years of rebuilding, and now we were building something new together. Not the family we'd lost, but the family we'd chosen to become. "Dad," Lily said as we cleared dishes, "do you ever regret not taking the settlement money?" I thought about the question I'd been asked dozens of times by reporters. prosecutors, and other wrongfully convicted individuals. $75 million versus the uncertainty of fighting corruption with no guarantee of victory. Never, I said, watching my son review case files for tomorrow's court appearance and my daughter edit footage for her documentary. Some things are worth more than money. Truth is one of them. Justice is another. But family is worth everything. The system that had tried to break me had instead revealed what couldn't be broken: the human capacity for resilience, the power of truth over lies, and the possibility of transformation, even in the darkest circumstances. 8 years in prison for crimes I didn't commit had been the worst experience of my life. Fighting back against the system that put me there had been the most important work I'd ever do. Justice, I'd learned, wasn't just about individual vindication. It was about building systems that protected everyone from the abuse of power. My story was ending, but the work would continue through the foundation, through my children, and through every person who chose courage over comfort when facing institutional corruption. The truth, as I told my children, was worth fighting for, even when it cost everything you thought you couldn't live without.